on!
I mean no harm.
They're not gonna like you much now. You just made a lot of enemies. We're gonna have to ride for a while. You still want to be on this horse?
Yes. Wherever you're going, take me with you.
You will come with me, the lonely herder said to the Navajo woman fleeing the land grabbers. Ayanna stared at the dust devils dancing across the sacred land, the pale morning sun doing little to warm her. Everything she owned, her family, her history, was tied to this place. But the brass buckles on the new prospector's belts glinted. A stark, foreign light against the ancient red rock, a symbol of a greed she had never known, a sound she had never heard. A group of men, hardened and uncaring, had set up their camp right on the edge of the canyon she had called home her entire life. They were there for the silver vein her grandfather had always spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, a sacred secret now shouted to the heavens by men with picks and dynamite. A stranger was waiting for her in the untamed wilderness of the Arizona Territory 1880. But he wasn't a suitor. He was a threat. You don't have to face them alone, her grandmother said softly from the doorway of their hogan, wringing her hands in her apron. We can tell the elders, let them speak to the spirits. Ayanna traced her fingers over the leather strap of her water bag. She was a woman, barely 20, but the weight of her family's survival lay on her shoulders. Her father had been gone for 2 seasons, following a hunt that never returned. The others were too old or too young to stand against men with such cold eyes. The spirits will not stop men with guns, grandmother, Ayanna replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The white men have no reverence for our ways. I have to go. Her grandmother crossed the room and took Ayanna's hands in hers. But to face them alone, little sparrow. Ayanna straightened her shoulders. I will be brave. I will speak for our land. They must hear. Words on paper. That was all she had to cling to, as she prepared to confront everything she had ever known about peace. The journey across the mesa was long and dusty, the landscape changing dramatically around her. Lush desert flowers gave way to rolling scrub, then jagged rock formations. Ayanna clutched the turquoise her mother had given her, a small, polished stone, rubbing it for the 100th time. Her people had lived on this land for generations, in a rhythm with the earth, the sun, the wind. They took only what they needed, gave thanks for what they were given. The men below were taking everything. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. As she neared the edge of the canyon, a sharp crack echoed from below, followed by a low rumble that shook the ground. The sound of dynamite. Ayanna's heart pounded against her ribs. They were already desecrating the sacred ground. She started to run, her sandals slapping against the baked earth, a desperate plea to the wind to carry her faster. The thought of what they were doing to her land filled her with a cold rage she had never felt. She reached the rim and peered over, seeing a cloud of red dust rising from the canyon floor. A group of men in denim and sweat-stained hats were cheering, their shouts a cacophony against the quiet beauty of the desert. One of them, a large man with a thick beard, held up a glittering rock. "Gold, boys, and plenty of it," he bellowed. Ayanna's hands clenched into fists, her anger overwhelming her fear. She picked up a loose stone and, with all her strength, hurled it down into the camp below. The stone landed with a thud and a cloud of dust, causing the men to stop their celebration and look up. "This is sacred ground," Ayanna screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You are trespassing on our land. Leave now." The large man with the beard laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that chilled her to the bone. "Well, well, boys," he said to his men. "Looks like we got ourselves a little bird who thinks she can fly." The men started to climb the steep, rocky path toward her, their faces contorted with a mixture of amusement and menace. Ayanna's heart pounded, her earlier bravado turning into a cold, hard fear. She turned and ran, her feet scrambling for purchase on the loose rock. She could hear them behind her, their heavy boots thudding against the earth, their laughter like the howl of coyotes. She ran without looking back, her lungs burning, the sun a relentless furnace on her back. She had to get back to the village, to warn her people. She didn't have a horse, but they did. They were gaining on her, The sound of their footsteps was closer now, a cruel rhythm to her desperate flight. A hand grabbed her arm, and Ayanna cried out, twisting away. It was a large, rough hand, the grip like iron. "Got you now, little bird," a man's voice sneered. She struggled, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. Just as she was about to be pulled to the ground, a blur of motion appeared out of nowhere. A man on a dark horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with the speed and precision of a predator. With a swift, fluid motion, he disarmed the man holding her, sending the man stumbling back. "Get on," the man on the horse said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached down a hand, calloused and strong. Ayanna, disoriented but not hesitant, took it. He pulled her up onto the horse behind him, and with a swift kick of his heels, the horse thundered off, leaving her pursuers in a cloud of dust and confusion. Ayanna clung to him, her face pressed against his back, her heart still pounding with a wild fear. He was a stranger, a man who had appeared from the very dust she was trying to escape. "Wyatt Morgan," he said, his voice flat. "They call me Wildfire. They're not going to like you much now. You just made a lot of enemies." He winced, a sharp intake of breath as he shifted his weight. "He's right behind me. A bounty hunter." Ayanna's stomach tightened. A bounty hunter. The men below were one problem. A man with a price on his head was a different kind of danger altogether. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice shaky. He ignored her, his eyes scanning the surrounding rocks as if expecting an attack. "We're going to have to ride for a while. You still want to be on this horse?" Ayanna's grip tightened on his jacket. "Yes," she whispered, her voice firming. "Wherever you're going, take me with you." The horse's hooves drummed a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth, a melody of flight and fear. Ayanna held on to the strange man, her world reduced to the scent of horse sweat and leather, the rasp of his breathing, the thrumming of his heartbeat against her cheek. He was her anchor, her only hope in this terrifying, unpredictable moment. They rode for what felt like an eternity, the landscape a blur of red rock and scrub brush. The sun beat down on them, a merciless presence in the vast, empty sky. Ayanna's throat was dry, her body aching from the unaccustomed jostling, but she dared not complain. He had saved her, a man with haunted eyes and a dangerous aura. She could feel the tension in his body, a coiled readiness for a fight that might be just around the next bend. They finally slowed to a trot, the horse's sides heaving with exertion. The man, Wyatt, pointed to a narrow, hidden trail that wound its way into a maze of canyons. "We'll lose them in here," he said, his voice a low, tired rasp. "This is Navajo country. They won't dare follow." Ayanna looked at him, surprised. "You know this land?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I know enough to stay alive." He dismounted, wincing as he put weight on his leg. "We'll go on foot from here. It's safer." Ayanna slid off the horse, her legs so wobbly she nearly fell. He reached out a hand to steady her, his touch brief and impersonal, but she felt a jolt of something unexpected, a sense of safety. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a cruel expanse of stone and dust where silence pressed down heavier than the heat itself. Wyatt moved ahead, his limp a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step purposeful despite the weight of old wounds. His broad back bore not only the strain of his body, but also the invisible burden of years of survival. He did not walk like a conqueror claiming the land. He walked like a man who had already fought too many battles just to remain alive. Ayanna followed, her gaze never leaving him. Every line of his frame spoke of danger and endurance. She remembered the way he had disarmed the prospector so swift it was almost invisible, a flick of violence honed by long practice. A man like him was forged in conflict, shaped by shadows she could only guess at. Somewhere behind them, a bounty hunter stalked, relentless, and she could not quiet the question rising inside her. What had this man done to deserve such pursuit? Fear coiled within her, but so too did gratitude. He had saved her life. That paradox gnawed at her heart with every step. The sun climbed higher, merciless. Their shadows shrank to nothing, puddles of black pressed beneath their boots. Hours slipped by with only the hiss of dry wind for company. Ayanna's thirst clawed at her throat, until it burned like fire. She fumbled with her water bag, but the skin was nearly empty. Foolishly, she had wasted much of it cooling her face during her panicked flight. Now her lips cracked, her tongue felt thick, and her vision blurred at the edges. Wyatt slowed and turned. His pale blue eyes, startling against the leathered brown of his skin, studied her with calm severity. "You need water," he said. It was not sympathy, only truth. "There's a spring ahead. We'll rest there." Relief shivered through her, but it came tangled with dread. He had not abandoned her, though she was a burden slowing his escape. That meant her fate was bound to his, for better or worse. The spring revealed itself like a miracle, small, rocky, fragile, but alive. A thin trickle of water gleamed silver against the red earth. Ayanna fell to her knees without hesitation. She cupped her hands, scooping greedily, letting the blessed coolness flood her throat, soothe the ache that had tormented her. It felt like life returning to her vein. Wyatt did not drink. He stood nearby, rifle resting loosely in his hand, gaze fixed on the horizon. His posture carried the unspoken truth. A man like him never let his guard down. "Thank you," Ayanna rasped, her voice hoarse. He answered with only a nod, his eyes locked on the distant mesa. "We can't stay long. They'll know we're heading this way." Her stomach clenched. She turned back to the vast emptiness behind them, half expecting to see dust rising from riders in pursuit. Nothing stirred, but the stillness frightened her more. Emptiness meant the enemy could come from anywhere, without warning. Wyatt lowered himself slowly onto a rock, his movements careful, measured by the pain of old wounds. He gestured for her to sit. She did, though every part of her trembled with nerves. "Tell me about this land," he said at last, his tone quieter, carrying an unexpected softness. "Why is it sacred?" Ayanna's eyes shifted to the spring, to the way sunlight danced on the water. Speaking of her people was never simple. These things were not just words, they were the marrow of her bones, the rhythm of her heartbeat. But she answered. "We are Navajo," she began, her voice low but steady. "This earth is not just ground to us. It is our mother. The sun is our father. The stars are our ancestors watching. Every stone, every plant, every stream carries our spirit." Her chest tightened. "There is silver in these lands, yes, but it is not only metal, it is memory. It binds us to those who came before. To tear it out is to wound the earth itself. To my people, that vein is sacred, it keeps us whole." The air between them thickened with silence. Wyatt's face betrayed nothing, but his hand tightened faintly on the rifle, as though her words struck some hidden chord. Perhaps he too knew the weight of ghosts. "They come," she whispered, eyes darkening. "Men who see only wealth. They carve the mountains, bleed the veins dry, and leave the land broken. To us, it is as though they cut into flesh. That is why we protect it, because losing it means losing ourselves." For a long moment, he said nothing. The desert wind hissed softly over stone and brush. He stared out at the horizon, but his expression had shifted, shadowed with something unreadable. Ayanna's heart pounded. She had trusted him with truth, but what if trust was a mistake? He was not her kin. He was not bound by her people's spirit. He was a man of violence, hunted and dangerous. What if, in time, he too turned his eyes toward the silver and saw only profit? Her breath caught when he finally looked at her. No greed glimmered there. Only the same weary determination, the heavy will of a man who lived each day on the edge of survival. Still, unease clung to her like heat. In the desert, even kindness could turn sharp, even safety could crumble in a heartbeat. And as the sun pressed down and the silence deepened, Ayanna could not shake the gnawing fear that trust itself might be the most dangerous choice she had made. Wyatt listened in silence, his gaze heavy and searching, the desert wind tugging at the brim of his hat as if urging him to look deeper than he ever had before. His eyes, usually sharp with suspicion and dulled by years of flight, softened just enough to reveal something more than a hardened drifter's watchfulness. For so long, he had thought of the land only as a backdrop, a vast stretch of wilderness to cross, to hide in, to bleed across when the chase grew too close. Dirt and stone, brush and river, mountain and canyon, it was nothing but cover. a stage on which violence played itself out. He had never considered the earth as something alive, something with a spirit, something that remembered. Yet now, under her words, the land itself seemed to shift, as though he had been blind to its heartbeat until this moment. "My people, we are of the earth," Ayanna said. Her voice carried the steady tone of someone who spoke not from belief alone but from inheritance, from blood and memory. She stood before him with the setting sun warming her skin to copper, her dark eyes filled with an unshakable fire. The dry wind tangled in her hair, long strands catching light like burnished black silk. She did not speak with anger, but with a quiet passion that seemed carved into her bones. "We believe in harmony, in balance. These men who come here, they do not understand. They see only what they can take. They are like a disease, spreading until there is nothing left." The words pierced him. Not because they were unfamiliar, he had seen the same destruction she described, but because she spoke them with a conviction that reminded him of everything he had once lost. Families burned out of their cabins, miners who would bleed a hillside dry and leave it hollowed like a carcass. He had seen towns spring up overnight, drunk on silver and gold, only to rot into ghost settlements when the veins gave out. Greed always left ashes. Wyatt nodded slowly, his throat dry, his voice low and edged with a kind of exhaustion that reached deeper than bone. "I've seen their kind before," he said. His words were rough, pulled from somewhere that hurt to touch. "They follow the gold, the silver, the easy money. They don't care what they destroy to get it. They don't care who pays the price." His eyes, gray as old iron, flicked toward the horizon where the desert bled into twilight. "I rode with men like that once. Thought maybe I was different. Thought maybe I could outrun what I was becoming. But they ruin everything. Always." Her gaze softened, though she did not move closer. She studied him as though weighing his soul against his words. Until now, Ayanna had seen him as something temporary, a protector in passing, a stranger bound to vanish once the dust cleared. But in this moment, as his voice dropped into that gravel of regret, she saw him not merely as a man with a gun and a shadowed past, but as something more, a spirit fractured in the same ways her world was being broken. For the first time, she recognized in him not just a shield but a mirror. They stood in the hollow of a canyon, red rock towering above them like cathedral walls. The dying light painted everything in shades of fire and sorrow. The earth smelled of dust and sage, and somewhere far off a hawk called, the sound slicing the silence. Wyatt shifted his weight, his hand unconsciously brushing the revolver at his hip as if the habit were bone deep. Yet his eyes stayed on her, drawn by the raw honesty of her voice. She stepped closer, her moccasins whispering against the sand. "You have run from something," she said, her words more observation than question. "I can see it in the way you look over your shoulder, the way your body carries tension even in stillness. You carry a wound inside you." Wyatt's jaw tightened. For years he had kept that truth buried beneath layers of silence and whiskey, beneath the endless rhythm of riding and hiding. But her words struck true. He let out a slow breath, heavy as the desert heat. "Maybe," he admitted. "But what good does it do to name ghosts? They don't let go just because you speak them." Ayanna tilted her head, the beads woven into her braids catching what little light remained. "Ghosts let go only when the living stop feeding them," she replied gently. "My people teach that the earth remembers all things, the blood spilled here, the laughter of children, the prayers whispered into the wind. Nothing is forgotten, not even pain. But pain can be carried differently. You can carry it like a weapon, or you can carry it like a seed." He stared at her, caught between disbelief and the aching possibility that she might be right. His life had been nothing but blood and running, the weight of names he could never speak aloud without summoning death behind him. Could pain really be a seed? Could something as jagged as memory grow into anything but more sorrow? Silence settled between them, not awkward but vast, like the desert itself. The shadows grew long, reaching across the sand until they met at their feet. For a moment, Wyatt thought of all the years he had lived without purpose, surviving but not living. drifting like tumbleweed pushed by winds he could not fight. For the first time, the idea that there might be another way flickered fragile as a flame in storm air. Ayana's eyes searched his face, and in them he saw not pity but recognition. They were both outsiders in this war of greed. She, a daughter of the Apache, standing against the slow death of her homeland. He, a fugitive, a man whose past had devoured every chance at peace. Two lives carved by different blades, yet somehow meeting here, in the wounded land between river and rock. He swallowed, voice rough. Maybe we're both fools, he said. You, trying to protect what's already half stolen. Me, thinking I can outrun the man I used to be. Her lips curved, not in a smile but in a shape close to sorrow. Or maybe, she whispered, we are the last ones who remember what matters. The words struck him harder than any bullet. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since he could remember, he saw not just the fight ahead, not just the blood and dust, but the possibility of something worth standing for, something beyond running, something rooted, like the land she spoke of. The night crept in around them, stars sparking alive one by one in the endless stretch of sky. The wind cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of mesquite smoke from some far-off fire. Wyatt pulled his coat tighter around him, though it was not the cold that made him shiver. It was the unfamiliar weight of hope, small and dangerous in his chest. He glanced at her again, her profile etched against the firelit horizon. She was more than a woman, more than the daughter of a people struggling to survive. She was a reminder that the earth itself had a soul, and perhaps, if he stayed, if he fought, he might find one again too. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not emptiness, but a kind of fragile bond, spun out of loss and longing, grief, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. In that quiet, something passed between them unspoken, yet undeniable. Wyatt shifted, the leather of his holster creaking softly. His hand lingered near his gun, but this time it was not in readiness for violence. It was in recognition of what had brought them both here. Survival, yes, but also the need for something greater than survival. The need for belonging, for purpose. Above them, the stars burned brighter, witnesses to a story still unwritten. Two souls marked by scars, drawn together by the greed of men who cared for neither. And in the hush of the desert night, Wyatt felt the truth settle over him like the weight of a promise. They were not alone anymore. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the canyon, Wyatt stood up. We need to keep moving, he said. The nights out here are cold, and they'll be looking for us. Ayana nodded, her heart a tangled knot of fear and determination. She was with a man she didn't know, a man who was a fugitive, a man who had more secrets than she could ever hope to uncover. But he was her only hope. Where are we going? She asked. My camp, he replied, his eyes meeting hers. A safe place. He reached out a hand, and Ayana took it. A place where the only law is honor, and the only justice is what you make for yourself. She held his gaze, her heart filled with a silent understanding. He was a man who lived by a code she had never known, a code of wildness and survival. But it was a code that she, a woman of a different kind of wildness, was beginning to understand. The journey to his safe place, a place of his own making, was just beginning. They rode through the night, the vast, star-filled sky a blanket of cold, diamond-like light above them. The wind was a cold, constant presence, a whisper of a forgotten world. Ayana, riding with Wyatt, felt a strange sense of peace. She was a woman of the desert, a woman of the earth. But this man, a man of the gun and the open road, was a part of her world now. His presence was a quiet strength, a silent promise that she was not alone. When they finally stopped, the moon was a pale sliver in the sky. They were in a small, hidden cave, a place where the air was still and warm. Wyatt built a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the ancient rock walls. He brought her a warm cup of coffee, the aroma a surprising, comforting presence in the wilderness. Drink this, he said, his voice soft. It'll warm you up. Ayana took the cup, her fingers wrapping around the warm metal. Wyatt Morgan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You are a strange man, A man of violence, but a man of honor. A man who runs from the law, but a man who protects a woman he doesn't know. He looked at her, his eyes serious. There are good men and bad men in this world, Ayanna. But there are also men who are a little of both. I was a man who lived by the gun, a man who did what he had to do to survive. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of the ghosts. He looked into the fire, his face a mask of profound sadness. I saw too much in the war. I saw too much of what men can do to each other. And I ran. I ran from the memories, from the pain. I ran from myself. He looked at her, his gaze intense. But you, Ayanna, you are a part of this land. You are a part of the earth. You are a part of something good. And you've made me see that there is still something to fight for, something worth dying for. His words were a confession, a raw, painful admission of his brokenness. Ayanna's heart ached for him. He was not just a fugitive. He was a man who was lost, a man who was seeking a home. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a soft, gentle comfort. "You have a home here, Wyatt Morgan," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "My people will welcome you. We will help you. We will fight for you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I can't ask you to do that," he said. "They are too dangerous. They will not give up. They will bring an army." Ayanna's gaze did not waver. "My people are not afraid of a fight," she said. "We have been fighting for our land for generations. We will not give up. We will not be pushed aside. This is our home. And you, Wyatt Morgan, you are now a part of it." He squeezed her hand, a small, grateful smile on his face. He was a man who had lived his life alone, but here, in this small, quiet cave, with this remarkable woman by his side, he was not alone anymore. He was home. The journey to Ayanna's camp was a long, painful blur for Wyatt. Each step was an agony, his leg a throbbing protest against the movement. He leaned heavily on Ayanna, whose small frame held an astonishing strength. She led him through a maze of canyons, along paths that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity, her movements silent and sure. The air grew cooler, the sun hotter, and the silence of the desert was broken only by the wind and Wyatt's occasional grunt of pain. He found himself admiring her quiet competence. She was nothing like the women he had known. She was a part of this land, as elemental and unyielding as the red rock around them. When they finally reached her camp, nestled in a hidden valley surrounded by towering stone spires, Wyatt collapsed onto a blanket. Ayanna's grandmother, a woman whose face was a roadmap of a long life lived in the sun, came forward with a bowl of water. She washed his wound with a gentle touch, and though she spoke a language Wyatt didn't understand, her eyes held a kindness that was universal. Ayanna explained to her grandmother what had happened, and the old woman nodded, her gaze on Wyatt, thoughtful and assessing. For the next few days, Wyatt's world narrowed to the small hogan he was given, the pain in his leg, and the presence of Ayanna. She brought him food and water, changed his bandages, and applied a cool poultice of herbs that worked wonders, not just on the pain but on his mind. He found himself watching her as she moved, fascinated by the grace of her movements, the strength in her shoulders, the way she spoke to her people in a soft, musical language. He tried to explain his past to her, the Civil War, the years of drifting, the bounty on his head, but she didn't seem to care. "Your past is like the dust blown by the wind," she told him one evening, her eyes on the fire. "It is here for a moment, but then it is gone. What matters is the man who sits here now." Her words were like a salve to his haunted soul. He was a man defined by his past, but she saw only the man he was in that moment. Wyatt's past caught up with him, however. One morning, a group of men rode into the canyon, the same men Ayanna had seen at the mouth of the sacred canyon. They were not alone. With them was a tall man with a cruel smile and cold eyes, the very man who had shot Wyatt. "Well, well, well," the man sneered, his gaze sweeping over the camp. "Look what we have here. A whole nest of jackals and a wounded dog. Wyatt Morgan, you can run, but you can't hide." Wyatt tensed, his hand instinctively going for his gun, but Ayanna's hand stopped him. "You are not well enough to fight," she said softly. The leader of the group, a burly man with a mustache, stepped forward. "We're not here for a fight, native girl. We're here for him," He's got a price on his head." The leader looked at Ayanna, then at the rest of her people. "And we want to know what you're doing with a wanted man in your camp. This is a very serious offense. Maybe you should hand him over, or you'll be on the receiving end of our justice." Lay. Ayanna looked at the man, then at Wyatt, who was struggling to stand. His face was pale from the effort, but his eyes were hard. He wasn't a man who would be taken without a fight. The men were outnumbered, but they were armed, and they were desperate. Ayanna stepped in front of Wyatt, her head held high. "He is our guest," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He is under our protection. You will not have him." The bounty hunter laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You think you can stop me? I'm here for my money. I've been chasing this man for 2 years. He killed my brother." Ayanna's eyes widened, and a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Wyatt's past wasn't just dust on the wind. It was blood on the ground. She looked at Wyatt, her gaze searching, asking for a truth he hadn't told her. Wyatt met her gaze, his expression etched with a deep, weary sorrow. He had never intended to tell her the whole story, but now he had no choice. He had to be honest with her, even if it cost him everything. "It was a fair fight," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "He drew on me first. He was a rustler, and I was just trying to do the right thing." The bounty hunter sneered. "The right thing? You shot him in the back." The lie hung in the air, a poisonous accusation. Ayanna looked from one man to the other, her heart a tangled knot of doubt and loyalty. She had come to trust this man, to see him as a symbol of hope. But what if he was just another lie? The bounty hunter reached for his gun, and Ayanna's people tensed, their hands going to their bows and spears. The standoff was a powder keg, ready to explode. But Ayanna held up a hand, silencing her people. "If you want him, you have to fight for him," she said to the bounty hunter. "But if he is lying, if he is the man you say he is, I will personally hand him over to you. I will not have a murderer on our land. But first, you must prove to me that you are a man of justice, not a man of greed." She pointed to a high rock on the canyon wall. "We will have a test of honor. My people will throw a spear, and you must shoot it out of the air. If you can, you will have my respect and the chance to take him away. If you can't, you will leave our land forever." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. The request was a strange one, a display of skill that had nothing to do with fighting, but he was a man of pride, and he had a reputation to uphold. "All right, native girl," he said with a cruel smile. "You've got a deal, but you better be sure you're not making a mistake. If you like Wild West love stories, or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second, and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here." The air was thick with tension. Ayanna's people stood in a silent, watchful circle, their faces grim. The bounty hunter, a man named Silas, stood with a confident swagger, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the red dust, his eyes burning with a venomous fury. "You think you've won, little native girl?" he sneered, his voice a low growl that carried a promise of violence. "You think a child's game proves anything? That man is a killer. A cold-blooded, back-shooting killer." He pointed a damning finger at Wyatt, who had limped back to the shadows of the hogan, his face pale with pain and something else, a deep-seated weariness that was older than the canyons. Ayanna's heart hammered against her ribs. She had trusted Wyatt. She had seen his kindness, his pain, his quiet strength. But the bounty hunter's words were a poison, a dark doubt that began to seep into her thoughts. A killer. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She looked at Wyatt, his face a mask of exhaustion, and then at the faces of her people. They were looking at her, their trust in her unwavering, but she could see the question in their eyes. The question was a challenge. Is this man truly worthy of our trust? The elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of 1,000 seasons, stepped forward. The chief, an old man named Hojo, raised a hand. His gaze was on Wyatt, assessing, unblinking. "The wind carries many stories," Hojo said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Some are true, and some are dust. Silas, you claim this man has a dark past. You claim his heart is without honor. Yet, he chose to protect us, not to run. Your words do not match his actions." Silas laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the silent valley. "Actions? He's a wild dog trapped in a canyon. He's cornered. He knows he can't outrun me forever. He killed my brother in cold blood, and I'll see him hang for it." He turned his gaze on Ayanna, his eyes filled with a predatory intensity. Ask him about the saloon in Abilene. Ask him about the name they gave him. Wildfire. A man who burns everything he touches. He's a menace. He's not a man of honor. He's a man of chaos. He'll bring that chaos to your people, and you will all burn with him. The words struck Ayanna like a physical blow. Wildfire. A man who burns everything he touches. It was a name that fit the harsh, unforgiving beauty of the land, but it was a name that carried a terrible weight. She looked at Wyatt, her heart a tangled knot of doubt and loyalty. She had come to know him as a man of quiet contemplation, a man who listened to the earth, a man who treated her with a gentle respect she had never known. But what if that was a lie? What if it was just a part of the mask he wore? She had to know. She had to ask. "Wyatt," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is what he says true?" Wyatt looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a raw, agonizing sorrow. The silence that followed was 1,000 years long. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Hojo, at the other elders, at the curious, worried faces of the young warriors. He saw their suspicion, their fear. He saw Ayanna's fragile trust hanging by a thread. He knew this was the moment of truth, the moment he had been running from his entire life, the moment his past would either bury him or set him free. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air a cold, sharp presence in his lung. "Silas's brother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. His name was Caleb, and he was a part of a gang of rustlers. He was trying to take a herd of cattle, and I was just trying to stop him. It was a fair fight, but he drew on me first. He gave me no choice." Silas scoffed. "A fair fight? He shot him in the back." The lie hung in the air, a poisonous accusation. Ayanna looked from one man to the other, her heart a tangled knot of doubt and loyalty. She had come to trust this man, to see him as a symbol of hope. But what if he was just another lie? The bounty hunter reached for his gun, and Ayanna's people tensed, their hands going to their bows and spears. The standoff was a powder keg, ready to explode. But Ayanna held up a hand, silencing her people. "If you want him, you have to fight for him," she said to the bounty hunter. "But if he is lying, if he is the man you say he is, I will personally hand him over to you. I will not have a murderer on our land. But first, you must prove to me that you are a man of justice, not a man of greed." She pointed to a high rock on the canyon wall. "We will have a test of honor. My people will throw a spear, and you must shoot it out of the air. If you can, you will have my respect and the chance to take him away. If you can't, you will leave our land forever." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. The request was a strange one, a display of skill that had nothing to do with fighting. But he was a man of pride, and he had a reputation to uphold. "All right, native girl," he said with a cruel smile. "You've got a deal, but you better be sure you're not making a mistake." The air was thick with a pregnant silence. Ayanna's people, though confused by the strange challenge, stood firm. Silas, his jaw clenched, drew his pistol. A young Navajo warrior, a boy of about 16, stepped forward, a spear in his hand. He looked at Silas, his young face grim. Then with a shout, he launched the spear. It flew through the air, a deadly arc against the blue sky. Silas was fast, his gun a blur of motion. He fired, and the sound echoed through the canyon, but the spear continued on its trajectory, embedding itself deep in the rock. Silas's face turned from a smirk to a grimace. He had missed. He had been so sure he wouldn't. But the wind, the strange wind of this land, had played tricks on him. Ayanna stepped forward. "You have failed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You have proven that you are not a man of honor. You will leave now." Silas's face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "This is a trick," he bellowed. "I'm not leaving until I have him." He looked at Wyatt, his eyes filled with a desperate, venomous hatred. "He's a killer, Ayanna. You don't know what he's done." Ayanna's gaze did not waver. "He is a man seeking a second chance, and on this land, we believe in second chances." Silas's eyes narrowed, his hand slowly reaching for his pistol. "Fine," he growled. "If you want a fight, you'll get one." But before he could draw his gun, a shot rang out from the canyon rim. A rock shattered just beside Silas's head, and the echo was followed by a voice, cold and authoritative. "That's enough, Silas. You've had your say. Now get out of here before I put a bullet in you." It was Wyatt. He had managed to crawl out of the hogan, his rifle held steady in his hands. His face was white with pain, but his eyes were pure steel. "Wyatt," Ayanna cried, rushing to his side. "You should be resting." He ignored her, his eyes fixed on Silas. "You're a liar, Silas, and a coward. My fight with your brother was a fair one. He drew on me, and I won. I didn't want to kill him, but he gave me no choice." Silas hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had been so sure of his righteousness, so sure of his cause, but the look in Wyatt's eyes was the look of a man telling the truth, the look of a man who had seen hell and lived to tell the tale. Silas finally gave a defeated snarl, and with a wave of his hand, he led his men away, leaving Ayanna and her people in peace. Wyatt lowered his rifle, the strength leaving his body. He collapsed back into Ayanna's arms, his face a mask of exhaustion. "They'll be back," he whispered. "He won't give up, not until he has me dead or alive." Ayanna held him close, her hand gently stroking his hair. "Then we will be ready for them," she said softly. For the next few weeks, Wyatt's world narrowed to the small hogan he was given. The traditional dwelling of the Navajo people is a shelter, home, and refuge. His days were filled with the quiet rhythm of the Navajo people. They were a people of harmony, balance, and resilience. Ayanna brought him food and water, her presence a calming balm to his troubled mind. Wyatt, his legs slowly mending, was an essential part of the tribe's life, teaching the men to ride and shoot with a precision they had never known. Ayanna, in turn, taught him the rhythm of the land, the songs of her people, the stories of her ancestors. The love between them had grown, a quiet, unspoken thing that was as natural as the sunrise over the red rock. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna asked him, "Why did you never settle down, Wyatt Morgan? Why did you keep running?" Wyatt looked at the dancing flames. "I was a wild one," he said. "They called me Wildfire. I was always searching for something, but I never knew what it was. I was a man who lived by the gun, a man who believed in the law of the strong. But after the war, I saw what that kind of life did to a man's soul. It hollowed me out, left me with nothing but ghosts. So I ran. I ran from the ghosts and the memories." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a raw honesty. "I was a man without honor. I've done things I'm not proud of." Ayanna took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "But you have honor now, Wyatt. You are fighting for us. You are protecting our land. You are helping my people. This is your chance at redemption." Her words were a balm to his soul, a quiet affirmation of a worthiness he hadn't felt in years. He squeezed her hand, a small, grateful smile on his face. He had been running his entire life. But here, in the heart of this ancient land, with this remarkable woman by his side, he had finally found a reason to stop. He had found a reason to stay. He had found a reason to fight. The sun rose and set, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and crimson. With each passing day, Wyatt grew stronger. The wound in his leg, though a constant ache, was no longer an obstacle. He rode with the men, teaching them the quick, decisive movements of a gunslinger. He showed them how to read the terrain, how to anticipate an ambush. He was a natural leader, and the men respected him, a fact that both humbled and surprised him. He had spent so long being an outcast, a man of solitude, that the sense of community was a foreign but welcome feeling. Ayanna, in turn, taught him the quiet wisdom of her people. She showed him how to track, not just an animal, but the subtle changes in the wind, the almost imperceptible movements of the earth. She taught him the names of the constellations in their language, the stories of the spirits who lived in the rocks and the sky. He had always seen the stars as distant, cold lights. She made them living things, a part of a vast, intricate tapestry that he was now a part of. Their love, a fragile, tender thing, grew with each shared moment. It was not a love of grand gestures or whispered promises. It was a love built on quiet trust, on shared glances across a fire, on the knowledge that they had both found in the other something they had been searching for their entire lives. For Wyatt, it was a sense of purpose, a reason to fight not just for himself, but for something good, something pure. For Ayanna, it was the feeling of being seen, not just as a woman, but as a warrior, a leader, a person of strength. One night, as they sat by the fire, a scout approached, his face grim. "They are coming," he said, his voice a low whisper. "The bounty hunter and his men, and they have brought more. They are bringing a mining company with them." The news was a cold splash of reality. This wasn't just a personal feud anymore. This was a war for the land, for the very soul of her people. The mining company had no regard for the law, for the land, for the people who lived on it. They saw only the glint of silver, and they would do anything to get it. Ayanna's face hardened, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective determination. This was the fight she had been preparing for, the fight that she knew would come. Wyatt stood, his hand going to the worn leather of his holster. "I'll go out and meet them," he said, his voice hard. "I'll draw them off, get them away from the village." Ayanna shook her head, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "This is our fight. We will face them together." Wyatt looked at her, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear. He knew the odds were against them. He had seen too many battles, too many pointless deaths. But he also knew the look in Ayanna's eyes. She was a woman of honor, a woman who would not back down. "All right, Ayanna," he said, his voice soft. "We'll face them together." The days that followed were a blur of preparations. They fortified the canyon entrance, set up traps, and prepared for a siege. The sun rose and set, painting the sky with a fierce, burning light, a perfect backdrop for the storm that was coming. The day of the battle dawned with a silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The sun was a harsh, unforgiving light, and the wind carried the smell of dust and fear. Ayanna and Wyatt stood at the entrance to the canyon, side by side. He was her strength, and she was his conscience. He had his rifle, and she had her bow. The enemy came on horseback, a long line of men with rifles glinting in the sun. The bounty hunter, Silas, rode at the front, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Wyatt Morgan," he bellowed, "come out and face me, coward." Wyatt's eyes met Ayanna's, and she saw in them a silent promise, a promise of honor, of love, of sacrifice. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The battle was a brutal, chaotic dance. Wyatt was a master of the gun, his shots finding their mark with a deadly accuracy. But the enemy had numbers on their side. Ayanna and her people fought with a fierce, desperate courage, their arrows flying fast and true. The fight raged for hours, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and war cries. In the midst of the chaos, Ayanna saw Silas making his way toward her. He was a man consumed by hatred, and he was coming for her. She raised her bow, an arrow knocked, her heart pounding. But as she was about to release it, another man, one of Silas's men, aimed his rifle at her. Wyatt saw it, and without a moment's hesitation, he threw himself in front of her. The shot rang out, and Wyatt fell to the ground, a single dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Wyatt!" Ayanna screamed, dropping her bow and rushing to his side. The world seemed to stop. The battle raged on around them, but Ayanna saw only Wyatt, his face pale, his eyes closed in pain. Silas reached them, a cruel smile on his face. "He chose her over his own life," he sneered. "Such a shame. Now you're all mine, native girl." But Ayanna was not defeated. She had Wyatt's rifle, and she had the fierce, protective love of a woman who had just seen her world crumble. She raised the rifle, her hands trembling, and with a single, clear shot, she sent Silas to the ground, his life's mission unfulfilled. The sight of their leader falling caused the remaining men to scatter, a panicked flight back into the wilderness. The battle was over, but at what cost? "Hey, friend," Go grab a full glass of water. People often forget to drink enough, and that's actually a pretty serious issue for you. The sun, a harsh, unforgiving eye in the sky, rose above the red rock spires, casting long, dark shadows across the canyon floor. The silence that preceded it was more terrifying than any noise, a heavy, suffocating stillness that held the promise of violence. Ayanna and Wyatt stood at the mouth of the canyon, a final, quiet moment of peace before the storm. He was her strength, and she was his conscience. He had his rifle, and she had her bow. His hand found hers, a calloused, warm presence in the cold morning air. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "you stay behind me. You protect your people, I'll protect you." Ayanna's heart ached. This was the vow of a man who was ready to die. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise that she would not let him. The enemy came on horseback, a long, dark line against the horizon. The bounty hunter, Silas, rode at the front, a triumphant sneer on his face. He was not just a man now. He was the embodiment of a greedy past, a relentless force of destruction. Behind him came the men from the mining company, their faces hard with an avarice that was a disease, a hunger that would devour the land and its people. "Wyatt Morgan," Silas bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, a taunting, cruel sound. "Come out and face me, coward." Wyatt's eyes met Ayanna's, and she saw in them a silent promise, a promise of honor, of love, of sacrifice. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was a clean, sharp sound, a signal for the chaos to begin. The battle was a brutal, chaotic dance. Wyatt was a master of the gun, his shots finding their mark with a deadly accuracy. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who had lived his life by the gun, a man who had been shaped by a world of violence and desperation. But here, his violence was a form of protection, a desperate act of preservation. He was a man who had spent his life running from a shadow, but now he was a man who was fighting for the light. Ayanna and her people fought with a fierce, desperate courage. Their arrows flew fast and true, a silent, deadly rain against the enemy. They were fighting for their home, for their history, for their very souls. Ayanna was a warrior. She was not the scared young woman who had stood on the canyon rim that day. She was a woman of the earth, a woman of the storm, a woman who would not be broken. The fight raged for hours, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and war cries, the smell of gunpowder and blood. In the midst of the chaos, Ayanna saw Silas making his way toward her. He was a man consumed by hatred, and he was coming for her. He had to kill her to get to Wyatt. He saw her as the heart of the resistance, the symbol of a people who refused to be conquered. She raised her bow, an arrow knocked, her heart pounding. But as she was about to release it, another man, one of Silas's men, aimed his rifle at her. The shot was a blur, a streak of light in her peripheral vision. Wyatt saw it, and without a moment's hesitation, he threw himself in front of her. The shot rang out, a sharp, final sound that seemed to silence the world. Ayanna saw the impact, the sudden jolt of his body, the single dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Wyatt!" she screamed, dropping her bow and rushing to his side. The world seemed to stop. The battle raged on around them, but Ayanna saw only Wyatt, his face pale, his eyes closed in pain. Silas reached them, a cruel smile on his face. "He chose her over his own life," he sneered. "Such a shame. Now you're all mine, native girl." But Ayanna was not defeated. The love she had for Wyatt, the fierce, protective love of a woman who had just seen her world crumble, was a fire in her soul. She looked at the rifle in Wyatt's hands, the rifle that had protected her people, and with a single, desperate, and powerful motion, she grabbed it. She had learned how to use it. She had watched him. She had listened to his words. She raised the rifle, her hands trembling, and with a single, clear shot, she sent Silas to the ground, his life's mission unfulfilled. The sight of their leader falling caused the remaining men to scatter, a panicked flight back into the wilderness. The battle was over. But at what cost? The silence that followed the battle was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the soft sobs of Ayanna. She knelt by Wyatt, his head cradled in her lap, her hands tracing the lines of his face. He was alive, but barely. The bullet had lodged in his chest, a cruel souvenir of his self-sacrifice. She held him, her tears falling on his cheek, a silent promise that she would not let him go. The elders came, their faces grave. They performed their ancient healing rituals, singing songs that had been sung for 1,000 generations. They worked with a gentle, patient urgency, using herbs and prayers, coaxing the life back into Wyatt's shattered body. For days and nights, Ayanna did not leave his side, her hand held tightly in his, her heart a fragile, trembling thing. Wyatt's recovery was slow, agonizing. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind haunted by the ghosts of his past. He would whisper names, the names of men who had died, names of places he had fled. But Ayanna was always there, a steady presence, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She would hold his hand, her voice a soft, soothing melody as she spoke to him of the future of the land, of her people, of their life together. When he was finally well enough to speak, his voice was a weak, barely, their whisper. "Ayanna," he said, his blue eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "I have to leave." Ayanna's heart broke. She had fought so hard for him, had risked everything for him. "No," she said, her voice a plea. "You cannot leave me." Wyatt shook his head, a single silent tear tracking down his cheek. "My past, Ayanna. It will always haunt me. It will always find me. And if I stay, it will find you too. I cannot risk that." Ayanna knew his words were true. His life was not meant for a peaceful existence in the canyon. He was a man of the open road, a man of the Wild West, a man who belonged to the cowboy love stories of a bygone era. Her own life was tied to the land, to her people, to her traditions. Their love, a fierce, beautiful thing, was born in a moment of violence and chaos, and perhaps it was not meant to last in a world of peace. It was a Wild West love story, a story of two souls from different worlds finding each other in a storm of danger. But now, the storm had passed. "I will not ask you to stay, Wyatt," she said, her voice a calm, sad whisper. "But I will not ask you to go either. I will wait. I will always wait." Wyatt looked at her, his heart filled with a love so profound, it was a physical ache. He reached for her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Ayanna," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "My Wild West love." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss of farewell, of promise, of love that transcended distance and time. He had found his honor, his redemption, and his purpose. But his destiny lay on the horizon, a journey into the unknown. He had to ride, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had found his soul. A few weeks later, Wyatt, Wildfire Morgan, now a man whole in spirit if not in body, stood at the canyon's edge, a horse saddled and waiting. He looked at the land, at the village, at the woman who had saved him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to run. He felt the need to ride. He had found healing, a kind of peace he never thought possible. Ayanna came to him, her face serene, a small, sad smile on her lips. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply looked at him, her eyes holding all the love and understanding in the world. He mounted his horse, and with one last look, he turned and rode toward the setting sun, a figure of strength and solitude against the vast expanse of the desert. She watched him go, a single tear finally falling. Her love story was not over, but it was not a neat, happy ending. It was a beginning, a hopeful beginning, a tale of a Wild West love that would continue to unfold, a Western love story for the ages, a best Wild West story in a world of endless possibilities. Ayanna turned back to her village, her people safe, her land secure, her heart full of a love that was a testament to the fact that even in the wildest of places, even in the darkest of times, hope and redemption were always just a horizon away. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The silence that followed the battle was deafening, a stark, profound contrast to the chaos of moments before. The air, still thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, was now filled with the low whimpers of the wounded and the soft, grieving sobs of Ayanna. She knelt by Wyatt, his head cradled in her lap, her hands tracing the lines of his face, now pale and drawn with pain. He was alive, but barely. The single, small wound on his chest was a dark, seeping testament to his ultimate act of sacrifice. His breath was shallow, each gasp a desperate, rattling struggle against the inevitable. Ayanna's world had narrowed to this one man, this one moment. The victorious shouts of her people, the scattered bodies of the enemy, the dust settling on the sacred ground, it all faded into a meaningless blur. There was only Wyatt, his life a fragile thread hanging by a promise. She held him, her tears falling on his cheek, a silent promise that she would not let him go. The elders came, their faces grave, their eyes filled with a weary sorrow. They performed their ancient healing rituals, singing songs that had been sung for 1,000 generations. They worked with a gentle, patient urgency, using herbs gathered from the high mesas and prayers passed down through the ages, to staunch the blood, to bind the wound, to coax the life back into Wyatt's shattered body. For days and nights, Ayanna did not leave his side, her hand held tightly in his, her heart a fragile, trembling thing, praying to spirits she had never known a white man could believe in. She spoke to him in their language, a soft, soothing melody of hope and life, whispering stories of the land, of the sun, of the future she still desperately hoped they would have together. She watched his chest rise and fall, the slow, labored rhythm of a man fighting for his soul. She washed his face, changed his bandages, and fed him broth spoonful by precious spoonful, her own body aching with fatigue, her spirit held aloft by a love she never knew she was capable of. Wyatt's recovery was slow, agonizing. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind haunted by the ghosts of his past. He would whisper names, the names of men who had died, names of places he had fled. He would relive the gunfights, the loneliness, the endless, dusty road. He would mutter about the cowboy love stories he'd heard in saloons, tales of a happy ending that felt like a distant, impossible myth. But Ayanna was always there, a steady presence, a beacon of light in the darkness. She would hold his hand, her voice a soft, soothing melody, speaking to him of the future of the land, of her people, of their life together. When he was finally well enough to speak, his voice was a weak, barely, their whisper, a rasp of a sound that held a deep, bottomless sorrow. "Ayanna," he said, his blue eyes filled with a raw, agonizing sadness, "I have to leave." Ayanna's heart broke. She had fought so hard for him, had risked everything for him. She had faced down a bounty hunter, had stood on the edge of her own destruction for this man. "No," she said, her voice a plea. "You cannot leave me. The past is gone. You are healed." Wyatt shook his head, a single silent tear tracking down his cheek. "My past, Ayanna, it will always haunt me. It will always find me. And if I stay, it will find you, too. I cannot risk that. The law of the gun is a cruel one. It never lets go." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a profound and painful love. "I found peace here. I found a sense of home and honor I never thought I would. And you gave me that. But I am not a man of peace. I am a man of violence. My presence is a storm on your horizon. I would be a burden, a danger. I am a Wild West love story, not a peaceful one. My story is written in dust and blood, not in the quiet soil of your home." Ayanna knew his words were true. His life was not meant for a peaceful existence in the canyon. He was a man of the open road, a man of the Wild West, a man who belonged to the fabled tales of a bygone era. Her own life was tied to the land, to her people, to her traditions. Their love, a fierce, beautiful thing, was born in a moment of violence and chaos, and perhaps it was not meant to last in a world of peace. It was a beautiful, tragic, Wild West love that was too wild to be tamed, too powerful to be contained. "I will not ask you to stay, Wyatt," she said, her voice a calm, sad whisper. "But I will not ask you to go, either. I will wait. I will always wait." Wyatt looked at her, his heart filled with a love so profound it was a physical ache. He reached for her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Ayanna," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "my Wild West love." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss of farewell, of promise, of love that transcended distance and time. He had found his honor, his redemption, and his purpose. But his destiny lay on the horizon, a journey into the unknown. He had to ride, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had found his soul. He was not a man who could ever truly be a part of their world, a world of harmony and quiet contemplation. His greatest act of love was not to stay, but to go. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. A few weeks later, Wyatt Wildfire Morgan, now a man whole in spirit, if not in body, stood at the canyon's edge, a horse saddled and waiting. He had spent his final days not in goodbye, but in preparation. He talked to the elders, his words a mix of gratitude and apology. He told them he had no money to offer, no material wealth, but he had given them something more, their freedom. He had shown them how to defend their land, how to stand against the tide of the white man's greed. Ayanna's grandmother, wise beyond her years, looked at him with a quiet understanding. "You came to us a man without a home," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You leave us a man with honor. That is a greater gift than any silver or gold." He had a final, quiet meal with Ayanna, a meal filled with unspoken words and shared sorrow. He gave her a small, hand-carved piece of turquoise, the same stone her mother had given her, a symbol of protection and peace. "For the journey ahead," he had whispered, "for both of us." He looked at the land, at the village, at the woman who had saved him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to run. He felt the need to ride. He had found healing, a kind of peace he never thought possible. He had found his purpose in Ayanna and her people. But his purpose was not to stay and become one of them. It was to ensure their survival, to protect them from the dangers that his presence would inevitably bring. Ayanna came to him, her face serene, a small, sad smile on her lips. She did not cry, she did not beg. She simply looked at him, her eyes holding all the love and understanding in the world. He mounted his horse, and with one last look, he turned and rode toward the setting sun, a figure of strength and solitude against the vast expanse of the desert. She watched him go, a single tear finally falling, a tear of release, and of a profound, beautiful sadness. Ayanna stood on the high cliff where she had last seen him, a solitary figure against the vast, empty sky. The single tear that had fallen on her cheek had long since dried, a salt-stained memory on the raw canvas of her grief and her newfound strength. She watched the sun, a fiery orb of a promise, dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, just as it had the day he rode away. He was a figure of strength and solitude against the vast expanse of the desert, and she was a figure of strength and solitude against the vast expanse of her grief. He had left to ensure her survival, to protect her from the dangers that his presence would inevitably bring. A tear of release and of a profound, beautiful sadness had finally fallen. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of her new life. The following days were a long, quiet, and profound period of healing. The echoes of the battle faded, replaced by the soft hum of life returning to normal. The canyon, once a place of violent conflict, was now a sanctuary. Ayanna, however, was not the same. The young woman who had lived a life of quiet tradition had been forged in the fire of war and loss. She walked with a different stride now, her back straight, her eyes filled with a clear, unwavering resolve. She took on a new leadership role, a blend of her traditional wisdom and the practical, hard-won lessons Wyatt had taught her. She became the bridge between her people's ancient ways and the brutal new world they were forced to confront. She spent her mornings on the high cliffs, her gaze fixed on the horizon, not waiting for him, but honoring his memory. He had shown her a world beyond her canyon walls, a world of both danger and possibility, and she was no longer afraid of it. He had given her a sense of purpose, a reason to fight not just for herself, but for something good, something pure. His absence was a silent, aching presence in her heart, but it was not a burden, it was a strength. His sacrifice had not been in vain. It had given her a profound sense of self. She taught the young warriors how to read a man's intentions, how to stand firm in the face of greed, and how to use the rifle he had left behind as a tool of justice, not a weapon of chaos. She showed them how to move silently through the canyons, how to use the shadows as a weapon, how to read the land as if it were a map. She spoke to the elders, her voice a low, steady whisper, convincing them to let her take on a more active role in the protection of their land. They had seen her courage, her wisdom, her fierce devotion, and they trusted her. She became the guardian of the canyons, a leader of her people, a warrior of her land. The harsh winter descended upon the land, turning the red rock into a canvas of white and gray. Life was a constant struggle for survival, a testament to the resilience of her people. The memory of Wyatt was a warm, comforting presence in the cold, a quiet fire in her heart. She often found herself thinking of him, of the way his eyes would soften when he looked at her, of the way his hands, calloused and strong, would hold hers. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he had found the peace he had been searching for. She knew he was riding, healing, and reflecting. He was not just a wanderer anymore. He was a man with a purpose. He was a man who was looking for a home, and she was a woman who was building one. Just as the first signs of spring began to appear, a new threat arrived. The men who came next were different. They were not hardened miners with picks and dynamite. They were men in suits and ties, their words as cold and sharp as the wind. They were led by a man named Agent Thorne, a man with a cruel smile and a stack of legal documents. He claimed to have a grant from the government, a legal decree that stated this land, a sacred, spiritual home for generations, now belonged to a powerful mining company. Ayanna and the elders met with them, their faces grim. "This land is ours," Ayanna said, her voice clear and strong. "It has been ours for generations. It is in our blood, our bones, our stories." Agent Thorne laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that chilled her to the bone. "Stories? I have papers, legal documents. The law is on our side, little native girl. You have no right to this land. You have no claim. The law, a concept as foreign and unforgiving as the desert itself, was a new kind of weapon. It was a cold, calculated form of theft that her people had no defense against. The men had no guns, only a legal document and a condescending smile, but they were a threat as dangerous as any bounty hunter. Ayanna knew that this was a different kind of war. This was not a war of strength, but a war of endurance. They could not win a battle against the law. They could not win a battle against the government. She spoke to the elders, her voice a low, steady whisper. "We will not fight them. We will outlast them. We will show them that we are not a threat, but a people of peace. We will use the law against them. We will find a way to make them see us, to hear our story." The elders, though hesitant, trusted her. They had seen her courage, her wisdom, her fierce devotion, and they knew she was their best hope. The men in suits and ties set up camp at the mouth of the canyon, a constant, unwanted presence in their lives. The air was thick with tension, a silent standoff between two very different worlds. Wyatt, meanwhile, was riding, healing, and reflecting. He had ridden for months, his journey a long, lonely, and profound period of self-discovery. He had been a man without a home, a man without a purpose, a man who had lived his life by the gun. But Ayanna had changed him. She had given him a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of honor. He had been a man who ran from his past, but now he was a man who was running towards his future. One night, as he sat by a lonely fire, the wind carried a story to his ears, a whisper of a new conflict in the canyons. He heard of the men in suits and ties, of the legal documents, of the new, silent war. He heard of the woman who was leading the resistance, a woman with a will of iron and a heart of gold. His heart ached with a profound, painful love. He had left to protect her, to ensure her survival, but his absence had created a new, more dangerous threat. He knew he had to return. His conscience called him back, a powerful, unwavering voice that he could not ignore. He had found his purpose in Ayanna and her people, and his purpose was not to leave, but to protect. He rode for days, pushing himself and his horse to their limits, his body aching with fatigue, but his spirit filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He was no longer a man who was running from his past. He was a man who was running towards his future. He was a man who was ready to fight for the woman he loved, for the people who had given him a home, for the land that had given him a sense of peace. He was a man who had been given a second chance, a man who had been given a purpose. He was a man who was finally home. He arrived at the mouth of the canyon just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in a final, fiery display of a dying day. The men in suits and ties were preparing to move in, their faces grim, their voices cold. Ayanna and her people were standing firm, their faces filled with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Just as the standoff was about to turn violent, a single figure appeared on the horizon, a silhouette of a man on a horse, a figure of strength and solitude against the vast expanse of the desert. The men in suits and ties stopped, their faces filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. It was Wyatt. He was no longer a man who was running. He was a man who was returning. He was a man who was ready to fight for the woman he loved, for the people who had given him a home, for the land that had given him a sense of peace. He was a man who had been given a second chance, a man who had been given a purpose. He was a man who was finally home. He rode toward Ayanna, his eyes, those startlingly clear blue eyes, filled with a profound and powerful love. She looked at him, her face filled with a mixture of shock and joy. He was no longer the man who had left her. He was a man who had been forged in the fire of loss and longing, a man who had found his purpose, a man who had found his way home. He dismounted, and in a single, fluid motion, he was at her side. He took her hand, his touch a warm, comforting presence in the cold night air. The bounty hunter was gone, the miners were defeated, and the men in suits and ties were now facing a man who had nothing to lose. Wyatt and Ayanna stood side by side, a silent, powerful, and unwavering force against the tide of history. Their love story was not over, but it was not a neat, happy ending. It was a beginning, a hopeful beginning, a tale of a Wild West love that would continue to unfold, a Western love story for the ages, a best Wild West story in a world of endless possibilities.